and it took 7 years before the courts would certify a legal death. I thought I just had to do everything possible to come through alive, as my family and my animal would have a very tough time to make a living. So there was no laudanum for me, nor any risk of the smashed up house. I stayed outside until the bars broke up and was lucky enough to make that long side of the bars that brought 7 of us through alive. The first man rescued about 4 p.m. on the 18th was picked up by the Austrian steamer Jenny, a tramp freighter that had loaded from Gulfport, Mississippi and Pensacola, Florida, bound for her home port of Trieste, Austria. This steamer had been in enough of the outer fringes of the storm near Key West so that her deck load of barreled rosin had all been washed overboard. The equipment aboard this steamer was very primitive. One lifeboat, no electric lights of any kind, and dependent on condensed steam to lubricate the cylinders of a triple expansion engine. When this first man was seen and reported to the captain, he immediately followed the immemorial code of the 7 seas. The steamer was maneuvered to the windward of the man and lay broadside to the wind and seas, undergoing the most sickening rolling, while an oil bag was lowered to smooth the seas as much as possible, and the lone boat then lowered with only 2 oarsmen in the lee of the steamer. The boat was really so small that 5 average men made as heavy a load as was at all safe in that wind and sea. When the boat returned with this man, it was soon found that there was only one man aboard the steamer that could speak English, a stoker in the fire room. When he had translated this man's story of what had happened at Long Key to the Key, the captain ordered his ship to be sailed in large circles, hoping to save some more men. This was done all that evening and until 1:30 in the morning of the 19th. During that time, they had picked up 49 men from all sorts of wreckage, our 7 being the very last. The captain afterwards stated that no more wreckage or men was sighted. He decided, as he did not have enough stores aboard to feed the extra 49, as well as his ship's crew, if he sailed for home, he turned and went back to Key West and turned us over to the United States authorities. I find that I am near enough the end of this tape that I should put instructions on as to what to do next. There is quite a little left, I know, but when this tape is unwound to the end, the reel that is then full should be reversed and put on this spindle so it can be also given another record, and the selector left as it is, so that this will be what might be called the 3rd record being put on this one tape. And then if it continues enough that there should be any to go on the 4th record, that reel itself must then be put on and upside down, turned over, and played through again, or rather a recording through again. So that with that much explanation at this time, I will stop the recording and turn this over and start and finish the story that I was reading about the wreck of the houseboat number 4 as a continuation of the present reel, of the present story. This same reel now that has just been filled up is to be turned over, and the recorder, the selector left on what would be the 2-3 spot on the recording. Beginning of reel 3 and the continuation of the wreck of houseboat number 4. We arrived in Key West about 10 a.m. but were not put ashore until all arrangements were completed. I understand that a price was paid per head to the captain for his salvage and care for the group. We were also furnished new clothing by the railway company, as most of us had only rags and ribbons when we landed aboard the steamer. The ship's crew had divided their few belongings among us, but that did little more than help cover our nakedness. From Long Key alone, there were as many as 150 men on that houseboat, and the day before the steamer St. Lucie had brought some 50 more men that had not even been set to work nor had their names recorded. The total number may have been as high as 175. The most diligent search has accounted for but 72 men that were rescued, so it is very possible that this was Florida's worst loss of life in a hurricane up to that time. A personal touch or two. My eldest son was a messenger boy for the Western Union in Miami at the time, and he was getting news firsthand of the Long Key disaster. The local Miami paper had reported the probable loss of water boat number 4 in the evening edition, but the paper did not get into my wife's hands until my son had come home that evening. She was sure that that reference to water boat number 4 meant houseboat number 4, and that I was probably lost. When we were allowed to go ashore in Key West, I had filed a telegram telling her of my safety. The press of other telegrams, press dispatches, and other personal wires delayed mine for about 20 minutes after that paper had arrived in my house. When a knock came at that time, my son was at the door ahead of his mother, and there was the night messenger boy with my wire. I have always been very glad that I filed that telegram when I did that afternoon. I also still have the small bundle of tattered pair of denim work pants and a scrap of shirt I was wearing when I went aboard the Jenny. As the Palm was one of the fastest tugs, we were frequently sent to Miami on special trips for important material when it had run short. I had known that we were slated to make such a trip on October the 20th and had written that I would be home on that date. The steamer Miami, belonging to the Flagler system, was in port in Key West through the storm, and as soon as we were turned over to the commissioner and properly clothed, we were put aboard the Miami for a return to the city of Miami. Accordingly, on the morning of the 20th, we steamed past Flower Rock Lighthouse about 10 a.m. and went ashore in Miami about 11. I was set to work at Miami and did not return to the work on the Keys again. I was put in charge of the suction dredge Tomoka, then in Lake Mabel near Fort Lauderdale. I later had word that the tug Palm had finally come ashore on Long Key, very little damaged, and was again fitted up and put to work. Pioneer River Boats. Before I go further with the work that I did with the Inland Waterway Transportation and Canal Company in dredging work, there was one other story that I had written about the old steamer Biscayne and the captain and engineer on that boat, which had to do with the building of the canal, of the railroad work on from Long Key toward Key West, that I have just recited the story of the hurricane that swept us away. And it is headed Pioneer River Boats. I do not pose as a modern Mark Twain with his wonderful tales of the palatial steamboats of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, nor can I hope to portray the men I have known with his face-oil pen, but I had a recent visit with the son of Captain Fitzgerald of the famous old steamer Chattahoochee that was in service along the Indian River in the early 1880s. This son was an apprentice pilot under his own father, and our mutual reminiscences brought back a vivid picture of my own association with the men that manned the Indian River steamers from 1890 until Flagler's Railroad put them out of business. As a Kansas farm boy, I had never seen a big steamer until I started to Florida in August in 1890. There had been single stickers at Kansas City, but the Mississippi boats had long given up their tricky trips up the Big Muddy. I traveled by rail to the west side of the river at Memphis, Mississippi River. At that time, there was no bridge across the river, but there was a side-wheel, double-track steamer waiting, and our entire train, coaches, and baggage cars were pushed on those two tracks, but not the locomotive. That steamer was a marvel to me, and I examined as much of everything on that lower deck as possible while we were ferried across to the other side. There, proper fitting of the rails was made, and another locomotive came down the long incline and snaked our train off and away around that big hill, and up to the top where the depot of the next railroad was situated. From there to Jacksonville was all rail again. But when we drew into the little shack depot on Hogan's Creek, I think my eyes must have stuck out like a fiddler crab's when I saw my first ocean-going ship, one of the Clyde steamers. From there, the rails still went south, and that evening I was landed in Titusville, where I slept under a mosquito for the first time in my life. From Titusville to Lake Worth was 2 days by the Indian River steamers Georgiana and St. Lucie to Jupiter Lighthouse, an 8-mile ride on the Celestial Railway from Jupiter to Juneau, and as a capping climax, a 10-mile ride in a racing sailboat with 2 young men who seemed to know I was a tenderfoot and handled that boat accordingly. There were 3 steel-hulled boats built in Wilmington, Delaware, that were the main fleet of the Indian River Steamboat Company: the St. Lucie, the St. Sebastian, and St. Augustine. The captain on the St. Lucie was Stephen Bravo, born in St. Augustine, who as a boy was forever on some power boat, finally apprenticing himself as a cub pilot on the City of Jacksonville, that was a regular winter tourist boat on the St. Johns River from Jacksonville to Sanford and back to Jacksonville. From that he graduated to regular pilot under various captains until he was made master of the St. Lucie. Captain Bravo had a brother Johnny who had a bent for engines, and in course of time he stood examination for his ticket, which I found had been issued by the same inspectors who later signed mine, Vorgel and Spencer of Jacksonville. The last I saw of these 2 brothers, they were on the same steamer, the Biscayne, which was one of the river steamers that Flagler used as workhorses among the Florida Keys when he was building the overseas railway. The Biscayne and the Tug Palm that I was chief of were both at Long Key a few days before the October hurricane of 1906, and our crew saw and heard a verbal passage at arms between Captain Steve and Chief Johnny. I am sure I have read somewhere had an almost duplicate story happening on the Mississippi. The Biscayne had just finished handling a barge load of rock aggregate for the concrete mixers and was off duty for an hour or so, and had come back to a pair of dolphins that served as a dock and was tying up to them. Captain Steve was at the deck edge where one of the bell pulls that reached the engine room was fastened. Chief Johnny was always a leisurely answerer of the bells. Captain Steve was rather high-strung and always saw 2 or 3 seconds ahead what was going to happen and pulled the bells rather fast accordingly. We were near enough that we could hear the bells and see the big paddle wheel stop, start, and stop again. I do not remember how many stops, reverses, stops, go-aheads that Captain Steve rang down to Johnny before he finally gave the jingle all done. But the paddle wheel was still stopping, reversing, stopping, going ahead, seesawing back and forth on those 2 dolphins and threatening to pull them up with the roots. We heard the captain shout over the railing down to Johnny, "What in H do you think you're doing?" The paddle wheel kept stopping and starting, and Chief Johnny finally answered back, "I'm obeying the bells you pulled." You pulled, and I'm almost done. Till then you can go to H yourself. A nice bit of brotherly repartee. Mates and deck hands had a code that was unbreakable where there was a keg or barrel of whiskey as part of the cargo. Many a hook was slipped up an inch or so, a small hole bored, and a reasonable amount of whiskey drained out, the hole plugged and the hook driven in place again and duly delivered to the consignee with a straight face on all hands concerned. Cub pilots had some surprising experiences with those old stern wheelers. The docks on the west side of Indian River were pretty long. The shoal water reached out from shore as much as 200 feet. The T-head docks usually banked up sand with the reversal of the big paddle wheel. If the rudders were partly turned and the boat backed up to that bank, the pressure on those 2 or 3 rudders was strong enough that if the pilot was not watching, the wheel would be jerked out of his hands and spun over as far as could go. Usually there was a short loop of strong rope fastened to the floor that would hold the wheel if the loop was slipped over a spoke. I never saw it happen, but there were 2 or 3 times on the river when some cub pilot thought he could hold everything with his hands and 1 foot on the lower spoke of the steering wheel. Those wheels were usually some 8 to 10 feet in diameter and usually set part way down below the Texas deck. Those hardy souls that tried holding spokes with 1 foot on a wheel suddenly found themselves shot out the opposite window and with such force that they sailed over the upper rail into the river. Once was usually enough. There are practically none of the steamboat men of the gay 90s that I knew in the heyday of Indian River and Lake Worth alive today. The steamer St. Lucie was wrecked on Old Rhodes Key by the October hurricane of 1906. The St. Augustine was taken off the Indian River run in 1897 and laid up in the North Jupiter River and slowly rotted down at her moorings. The St. Sebastian was sold somewhere north, about Albemarle Sound, and the captain and mates took over the playboats of the winter tourists of the diesel tugs that pushed great barges up and down the inland rivers. Gone are the palaces of Mark Twain's days, and the paler setting of what was one of the greatest transportations of the United States made its final bows at the end of the 19th century while I was living on the lower east coast of Florida. I find this story regarding Joe Jefferson's ice plant that was built in West Palm Beach that I have not mentioned yet in any of it. And it's called Joe Jefferson's Ice Plant. As has been stated heretofore, there was a man in Florida, there's a man living in Florida, who was with the old sawmill engineers of long ago by the name of Frog Smith. And I noticed that this starts off by calling attention to Frog Smith. George Jefferson's ice plant. Frog Smith's last tale of the old sawmill engine at Quincy reminds me of the things that happened to an old-time engineer when he took over the New York 50-ton ice machine that Joseph Jefferson had built in the growing town of West Palm Beach, while that town was still the terminus of Flagler's Railway. Mr. Jefferson had as his construction engineer an old-time Scotch marine engineer, and the plans for the new ice factory and electric plant were in this man's hands, and the buildings were almost completed when I was appointed as a York Company foreman engineer to receive the material as it was shipped in and be ready to assist the erecting engineer when he would arrive from a job he was then finishing in New Orleans. That job took longer than was planned, and as the local company was very anxious to get their plant going, I received orders to build the brine tank and have it and as much of the other foundation work for the Corliss engine and Robert's tubular boiler and the foundation of the De Laval steam turbine electric installation. We had the Corliss engine and direct connected ammonia compressor almost completed, and the boiler installed and a well dug before the chief erector finally arrived. From that time on, the work progressed very rapidly, and then it was up to the York boss to run a 30-day test and make a thorough test of the machine in all its workings. When this test had been finished and the plant was accepted as doing satisfactory work, the York engineer left for his next job, and I was out of a job, as the manager of the plant could not see me at the price set by the York engineer. Neither did the Scotch engineer survive as chief in the work. The manager advertised, and a man from one of the largest sawmills near Neoga, Florida, was hired and put in charge. But the first thing he did was to over-oil the ammonia compressor whenever he smelled any ammonia. The ammonia system was soon so laden with oil that the tank temperature could not be kept down to a proper freezing degree, and the tonnage of ice began to fall off. Poor man, he felt that the ammonia had lost its strength, so he began adding drum after drum of fresh ammonia, and things were only going from bad to worse, with the ice making Finally, this engineer asked the manager to let him shut down the machine so he could open the compressor cylinder heads and see why the valves were not holding the gas pressure, which also had been worked up far past its normal working pressure. I was on another job by that time and was much surprised when one morning when one of the colored men woke me up about 3 o'clock in the morning and said the engineer and the plant manager at the ice plant wanted me to come at once, as there seemed to be a terrible pressure pushing up the compressor heads, and they were afraid something had or would blow up. I went at once to see what they were talking about. Sure enough, that cylinder head was pushing up, but there were still some 3 threads showing above the taps on all the bolts. I called their attention to this fact, took a spanner wrench and loosened all of the taps about a turn and a half, and the cylinder head did not rise anymore. We took the head completely off, and at once I saw what had been happening. Smell of ammonia came because the piston rod packing was not tightened up as it should have been. The metallic packing that should prevent leakage of the gas was self-lubricated, and the extra oil that had been fed into the ammonia gas had never been purged from the oil trap that is in the gas line. I asked both the manager and the engineer if they wanted the machine to be put in running order, and as they had no idea what to do further, they both said yes. We bolted those heads right down, compressor heads right down, called for steam, and turned the corliss over just enough to put some pressure on the oil trap. This trap would hold about 5 gallons, and I then purged the trap of about that much oil. Then we brought the engine up to normal speed and ran the plant for a couple of hours and again drew out over a gallon of oil from the trap. We kept this process up all day and took out some 8 or 10 gallons of oil. Meanwhile, the tank temperature was slowly going down past 12 degrees, then 14, then 16, and finally we had the 18 degrees that the machine was supposed to work best at, and before the 24 hours was up, the tank man was again pulling ice at the 50-ton rate. That is one of the help your neighbor jobs that I have been most mad about, even to this day. When I asked that sawmill engineer and the starchy manager if they understood what I had done, neither one had the grace to say thank you, which I would have taken as good as pay. Neither did either ask what my bill was. I expect they thought I was still working for the York Company. I learned one good lesson. The more you charge, the better they are suited that you know more than they do. Oh well, I'm no longer a consulting engineer, and I have no chance to lord it over some know-it-alls anymore. The Joe Jefferson named was the great actor of the great gay 90s. At the time of this story, there was an alligator farm run by Joe Frazee. Some tourist was told that Jefferson was Alligator Joe. She rushed up to him and addressed him as Alligator Joe. Jefferson replied with old-fashioned courtesy, "Dear lady, I admit the Joe, but deny the alligator." Here is another little bit of material that I have written. It had to do with the entrance of Sandwich Islands as our 49th state, and it goes as follows. They undersold Florida. One of the most lasting memories of my first acquaintance with the Indian River and Lake Worth coastal area was the first box of real Spanish pineapples that were waiting at the Melbourne dock when I was on my way to Lake Worth in August of 1890. Melbourne was about the northern end of the part of the state where pineapples could be grown as a commercial success. From that point south, almost all the land west of the river was either already planted or being cleared by hand labor for planting as soon as the slips could be obtained from the Florida Keys far to the south, or from already bearing plants as soon as the ripe apples had been snapped off. The further south the steamer traveled, the greater number of boxes of ripe fruit was waiting for the return trip at these same steamers to pick up all they could carry and deliver them to the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West Railway at Titusville, to be delivered to either Clyde, Line, or Morgan ships in Jacksonville for the northeast markets. Usually in the height of the crop season, the steamers could not handle all the crop, and small sailing craft were pressed into service to pick up loads from small shippers. These were the days when pineapples were a big money crop. However, in the late 90s, the islands that will soon be the 50th state of the United States of America began to find that the island climate was almost perfectly adapted to the growing of pineapples, especially as cheaper labor was available from Japan and the cost of fertilizer was almost nil, while our sandy soil called for heavy outlays for fertilizer. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Dole and other great companies around Honolulu were putting their crop, both fresh and canned, into New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago markets cheaper than the Florida growers could afford. Plantations were slowly abandoned and orange trees planted instead. Of late years, most of the Indian River country has also gone more heavily into the truck farming industry and are making good at it. The orange growers also have a fair market for considerable citrus products overseas to the very countries on the Mediterranean Sea where the Christmas oranges used to come from, that we sometimes found in our stockings Christmas morning when I was a boy in western Kansas. Growing pineapples has faded out of the production economy of Florida. Was it Billy? I find that I have still considerable material that was printed in the Tampa Tribune that has not been recorded on this, so I'm going ahead just as I pick them up now. Was it Billy? Billy Bowlegs was a very famous Indian in the days when I first went to Florida in the gay 90s. And here's what I have said at this time. This is very late. It was written somewhere in the early 1950s. I have been somewhat intrigued since the recent pictures of Billy Bowlegs appeared on the Pioneer Florida page, wondering if it is the same man that came to Lake Worth during the gay 90s to trade at U.D. Hendrickson's store. I know that was many years ago, and yet the man I knew under that name was a young, upstanding man, apparently about my own age, and it's possible it was his picture I saw. Of course, I realize that the places and names we gave them on Lake Worth in those days are no longer known as such, and their locations have been almost obliterated by the restless and wrecking hand of man in his endeavors to improve and ruin what God had made of that beautiful landlocked lagoon. But I must use some of the old names to locate the path that Billy and some of his people had to travel to bring their cypress canoes from the big lake, Okeechobee, or any part of the then unknown Everglades. There was a spot on the west side of Lake Worth, about 5 miles south of the north end of the lake, that was known as Dimmick's Ditch, now known as Erman's River, where the banks were so low that any real high water in the back country overflowed directly into the salt water of the lake. And of course, all the back country would also be flooded enough to allow of those Indian canoes being pulled to and into the lake, where I have seen them being pulled along near the shore on either side until one or another of the two trading stores could be reached. In those days, the Seminoles had several other places along the lower east coast where their canoes could get through for trading trips. The further south of such places was Fort Pierce on Indian River. Further north of these places was Fort Pierce on Indian River, then going south, Stewart, Jupiter, Lake Worth, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, and last the Miami River. These trading trips might be just a single person, more often a family, and at times almost a whole tribe. During those early days, those Indian trips were never looked on with any apprehension, as the last Indian War had thoroughly quenched their ideas that the Seminoles could whip the whole United States. If it is so that the present Billy Bowlegs and old Johnny Jumper are still alive, I hope someone can assure them that I still remember those days when they came to Lake Worth and wish to congratulate them on their many years. Following that, he marked his 92nd birthday and he went to a class reunion. W.H. Sanders of Inverness, Florida, whose contributions to this page are always interesting and informative, celebrated the 92nd anniversary of his birth, June the 3rd. The following day, he attended the 70th reunion of his class at the Kansas State University, where he taught agricultural engineering from 1912 to 1930, then returned to Florida. He writes, I took this trip by rail as a sort of farewell to the days when the railroads were the main way of travel, and over the same road that I had traveled in 1890 when I first came to Florida, and as far south as Lake Worth, where my future wife was then living. That dear lady helped fight our way with me for almost 65 years. She passed on 5 years ago, August the 1st. While I was north, I saw my latest 3 great-grandchildren. I have 18 scattered from Massachusetts to Kansas and points in between. It took a week in 1890 to travel from Kansas to Lake Worth. It took 2 nights and 2.5 days from Inverness to Manhattan. By plane 3 years ago from Tampa, by the way of New Orleans and Kansas City, it took a little less than 5 hours. They say jets are still faster, so we are both 92 years of age. Lots of new things have happened in our time. Almost one would like for another 10 years or so to see what utter foolishness the human race can get into and somehow muddle through. For we as a race gain good sense very slowly. Here is one that has to do with one of my recent trips north, and is entitled, He Sees His Work by Plane. This was also in the Tampa Tribune. W.H. Sanders of Inverness recently returned from an airplane trip to visit great-grandchildren and grandchildren in Massachusetts, in the course of which he was thrilled by the view from the air of a great waterways project on which he was employed 50 years ago. I've had a rather curious revisitation of one of the places where I had so much to do with the finishing of the coastal waterway between the St. Johns River and the North River next to St. Augustine way back in 1909 to 11 in the Pablo Creek Valley. This past July, I promised myself that I would fly from Tampa to Boston for a visit with a granddaughter and her family of 6 great-grandchildren that I had never had a chance to see. And I wanted very strongly to have a look-see at the children, to size them up as coming somewhere near a family tradition. I was also fortunate in seeing another great-granddaughter who came from California to have a look-see at me, which all happened as per schedule in Wellesley, Massachusetts. I had no idea where the plane route from Tampa by the way of Washington, D.C. would be while still in Florida skies. However, I am always busy trying to see the look of things on the ground, and was doing so on this trip. We were evidently high enough so that a wide area could be seen if there were a few clouds. We had been airborne almost an hour when when I was very sure I was seeing the north end of Indian River, then Mosquito Lagoon, then St. Augustine, and North River. Most of this seemed to be somewhat east of our plain route, but I noticed that we seemed to be shifting more to the east, and sure enough, the cabbage swamp at the head of Pablo Creek was almost directly below the plain. Our first permanent camp was made close to Dewey when I was doing that dredging work there at the headquarters of the Pablo Creek, and I could see the windings of the old creek as well as the inland waterway just as it was when we had finished the digging 48 years ago. Then as we flew on down the valley, Pablo Valley, the majestic St. John's River showed up from Dames Point to the breakwater out into the Atlantic Ocean. I must confess, it was one of the thrills of a long engineering life to have such a panorama of one of the major works that I had had a hand in the doing. There is just one more thrill I still crave, and that is a plane ride over the Florida Keys to see once more Long Key, from which I was blown away by the 1906 hurricane and picked up at 1:30 a.m. in the morning within 40 miles of the town of Matanzas on the North Cuban coast by the Austrian steamer Jenny. This last wish is perhaps too much to hope for, but it will do to dream about. I find among the clippings another one headed, "Panther traveled south when the weather got cold." This was a legend that was told to me during the years that I was working for the Canal Company and digging out the last of the remaining cut between St. Augustine and St. John's River. Defied the hunters and the dogs, and the heading of this is that Panther traveled south when the weather got cold. Some of the stories of bear and panther fights that have been printed on the Pioneer page bring to mind a legend that is told of a traveling panther that ranged from the St. John's River south through Pablo Creek Valley, the Turnbull Hammock, and at times as far as the swamps near New Smyrna. The panther was identified by an injured toe on the left hind foot. There was no definite proof that anyone had ever seen the animal, but there were several stories of having been trailed by it and almost scared to death with its shrill cries, which were claimed to have afterwards been verified when the telltale footprints were found after the scare was over. I first heard of it when the people living at Pablo Beach were told that the Coastline Canal Company was establishing a camp at Oak Landing near the headwaters of Pablo Creek. We were warned that the panther was sure to come through our camp in the nighttime, and his or her huge tracks would be seen in the roadways. The peculiar thing about the legend was that even a panther apparently was not fond of cold weather and did as the Yankee tourists do, came south a long ways with the first cold spell and did not go north until spring was well on the way. The legend also has it that this panther was much above the average as to size, the footmarks rivaling those of a St. Bernard dog, and the walking stride far beyond that of a large hound dog. Also, the cattlemen claimed that it could and did pull down calves and shoats, but was smart enough to keep out of sight and smell of the best hounds in that whole section. According to the legend, it had been some 12 years that this animal had been tracked on its journeys north and south. As to any tracks in our camp, none were ever reported, but the road on the beach side was regularly reported as having shown those giant tracks the 3 seasons we had our camp at Oak Landing.